The day Elvira Underwood arrived in Coldwater Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, every man in town found his voice. Every man, that is, except Calvin Sutton, who simply watched her step down from the stagecoach with those sharp hazel eyes of his, and then went back to mending the split leather of his saddle, as though the most extraordinary woman he had ever seen in his 28 years of living was just another Tuesday. Coldwater Flats was the kind of town that existed in a state of perpetual negotiation with the desert. The buildings were sun-bleached and stubborn, the streets were either dust or mud depending on the mood of the sky, and the people who stayed there really stayed, not just passed through on their way to somewhere better, had a particular quality about them that could only be described as determined. They had chosen this place. They had looked at the wind-scoured mesa and the rattlesnake scrub and the relentless blaze of the southwestern sun and said, "Yes, this is where I will build my life." It took a specific kind of stubbornness to mean it. Elvira Underwood had that stubbornness in abundance. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet of practical brown felt, and she carried herself with a posture that spoke of someone who had been told repeatedly to make herself smaller and had consistently declined. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, where she had spent 3 years keeping books for a dry goods merchant named Aldous Prentice, who paid her half of what he paid his male clerks, and then acted surprised when she found a better offer. The better offer had come in the form of a letter from the Coldwater Flats Schoolhouse Committee, which was desperately in need of a schoolteacher and willing to pay $50 a month plus lodging to anyone willing to take the position. Elvira had written back the same day. She had not known, when she stepped off that stagecoach and felt the New Mexico heat settle over her like a second skin, that the quiet man sitting on the bench outside the livery stable would be the defining fact of her life for every year she had left to live. She had not known that the way he barely glanced at her, not dismissive, just contained, as though he were conserving something precious, would stay with her long after every other memory of that first day had faded. She had not known any of it. She had known only that the air smelled of sage and red clay, and that the sky was so enormous it made her feel simultaneously very small and very free, and that somewhere in this rough-edged town there was a classroom with her name on the door. Well, there was going to be her name on the door. First, she had to survive the welcoming committee. Miss Underwood, Miss Elvira Underwood. A large woman in a flower-printed dress was barreling toward the stagecoach with the energy of a freight train and the warmth of a grandmother. "I am Margaret Hobbs, treasurer of the school committee, and we are so glad you have come. So glad. You cannot imagine the state of things. Last month we had 14 children and no teacher at all, and young Tobias Marsh tried to teach the alphabet himself, which would have been perfectly noble if Tobias Marsh knew the alphabet, which I am sorry to say he does not, entirely." Elvira shook the woman's hand and felt immediately, powerfully at ease. "Mrs. Hobbs," she said, "it is a genuine pleasure. I can assure you the alphabet and I are old friends." "Wonderful, wonderful." Margaret Hobbs was already guiding her toward the main street with a firm hand on her elbow. "Now, your lodging is above the milliner's shop on 2nd Street. Mrs. Adjora Kessler owns it. She is a very good woman and an excellent neighbor. She will not disturb you unless the town is actually on fire. Your schoolhouse is 3 blocks that way. Your students range from ages 6 to 15, and I must warn you that the Caldwell twins, Benjamin and Robert, are a particular challenge, but they are essentially good-hearted boys who simply require a very firm hand and possibly a miracle." Elvira was nodding and trying simultaneously to absorb all of this information while also taking in the town itself. The general store, the telegraph office, the hotel with its sagging porch, the saloon that was already open despite the fact that it was not yet noon, the small stone church at the far end of the street, and the livery stable, outside of which a man in a battered hat sat on a bench with a length of bridle leather across his knees and a look of profound undisturbed peace on his angular face. "Who is that?" she asked, interrupting Margaret Hobbs mid-sentence about the curriculum. Margaret Hobbs followed her gaze. "That is Calvin Sutton," she said, and there was something in her voice, affection and bewilderment in equal measure. "He is our farrier, best one in the territory if you ask the horses. Wonderful man, very quiet." "How quiet?" Elvira asked. Margaret Hobbs considered this. "Well," she said, "there is a running bet at the saloon which I do not frequent personally, of course, but one hears things as to whether Calvin Sutton has spoken more than 50 words in a single calendar month. No one has ever won the yes side of that bet." Elvira looked at Calvin Sutton again. He had finished the examination of his leather and was now just sitting in the sun with his eyes closed and his long legs stretched out in front of him, and there was something about the absolute stillness of him that was not emptiness. It was the opposite of emptiness. It was the stillness of a man who was paying attention to everything. She stored that observation away and followed Margaret Hobbs to see her lodgings. The schoolhouse was a single low-ceilinged room with 12 rough wooden desks, a blackboard that had seen better decades, a small iron stove in the corner, and a shelf of books that Elvira catalogued with the swift efficiency of someone who has spent years caring about exactly this kind of thing. She spent the rest of that first afternoon arranging and rearranging and planning, and by the time she walked back to her room above Mrs. Kessler's shop, her mind was buzzing with lesson plans, and the sun was painting the mesa in colors that she did not have words for in any language she had ever studied. On the street below her window, she could see the livery stable. The bench outside it was empty now, but the large doors were open, and she could hear the steady, rhythmic sound of hammer on metal, and she thought about a man who was very quiet in a way that was full rather than empty, and she told herself firmly that she had come to Coldwater Flats to teach children the alphabet, not to wonder about farriers. She was right about that. She was also wrong about it, in the way that people are always wrong when they tell themselves very firmly what they are not going to do. School began the following Monday, and Elvira was ready. She had spent the weekend writing out lessons, organizing the books, learning the names of her 14 students from the roll sheet Margaret Hobbs had provided, and making the acquaintance of Mrs. Elvira Kessler, who was a compact and elegant woman of Nigerian heritage whose husband had died of fever 2 years prior, and who had built her millinery business with such fierce competence that she was now, by any measure, one of the most financially stable people in Coldwater Flats. Elvira Kessler had welcomed Elvira with tea and direct questions, and a complete absence of small talk that Elvira found deeply refreshing. "You are not afraid," Elvira said, studying her on that first evening over cups of strong black tea. "A woman alone coming all this way, you are not afraid." "I did not say that," Elvira said carefully. "I said I was determined." Elvira had smiled at that. It was the beginning of what would become a genuine friendship. Monday arrived. The children arrived. The Caldwell twins arrived last, with identical expressions of speculative interest that suggested they were already planning something, and Elvira met their gaze with a pleasantness so calm and so utterly unrattled that both boys blinked and sat down immediately. She had learned in Abilene that children who expected to be handled firmly were often more effectively managed by someone who simply declined to be alarmed. The day went well. The week went well. Elvira fell into a rhythm: mornings with the children, afternoons planning or walking, evenings with Elvira or alone with her books, and Coldwater Flats began to take on the texture of home rather than destination. It was on a Thursday afternoon in her second week that she passed the livery stable. At the moment, Calvin Sutton was leading a chestnut mare out through the big double doors. He was talking to the horse. She could hear him from halfway down the street, a low, even murmur, nothing she could parse into words, but a sound that carried in it such a quality of gentleness that she slowed her steps without meaning to. The mare was clearly agitated, her ears flat, her hooves uncertain on the dirt, and Calvin was walking beside her with one hand resting lightly on her neck and talking in that low, continuous way, and the horse was calming visibly with every step. He looked up when Elvira was about 10 feet away and stopped talking. Not startled, just stopped, the way a man does when he becomes aware of an audience he did not anticipate. "I am sorry," she said, stopping too. "I was not trying to interrupt. That was remarkable." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was the kind of face that weather and work had put character into, not handsome in any conventional way, but interesting, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something durable, and eyes that were a very specific shade of gray-green that she could not immediately categorize. "She is afraid of the farrier's hammer," he said. It was 4 words more than she had expected, given what Margaret Hobbs had told her. His voice was low and unhurried, with a cadence that suggested each word had been individually selected for accuracy, getting her used to sound before the shoe. "That is very kind," Elvira said, "to take that time." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and then he went back to leading the mare in slow circles. The conversation, such as it was, appeared to be finished. She walked on, and she was not sure exactly why her heart was doing something she did not immediately have a name for. The months moved in that particular way that months move in a place you are learning to love, quickly in retrospect, slowly in the living. By midsummer, Elvira had established herself as a teacher of genuine skill and some local legend, on account of the Caldwell twins having turned, under her patient and entirely unfrightened management, from class terrors into something approaching enthusiastic students. Benjamin had discovered a talent for arithmetic. Robert had discovered that he liked to draw maps. Elvira had discovered that what troubled children most often needed was not discipline, but the particular variety of respect that comes from someone paying careful and genuine attention to who they actually were. She had also become, by the slow accumulation of small exchanges, a person who had occasional conversations with Calvin Sutton. It had started with the mare. He had brought the horse by the schoolhouse one afternoon, fully shod now and moving easily, and Elvira had come out to meet them, and he had told her with the economy of language that was, she was learning, simply how he thought that the horse was doing well. After that, there were other small exchanges. He had once stopped to help her when she was struggling to carry a large stack of new books from the general store to the schoolhouse, and he had picked up half the stack without being asked, and walked the 3 blocks in silence that was, peculiarly, not uncomfortable at all. He had once appeared at the schoolhouse door on a cold November morning to fix a draft in the stovepipe before she had even realized it needed fixing, and when she asked how he had known, he had said simply, "Smoke was going the wrong way," and left. She had started paying attention to these small acts, and then she had started paying attention to him. The town of Coldwater Flats paid attention to Calvin Sutton in a way that was affectionate but somewhat helpless. They respected him enormously. He was, as Margaret Hobbs had said, the best farrier in the territory, and his reputation extended well beyond the town limits, with ranchers riding in from 30 miles away to have their animals worked on by his hands. He was also, when called upon, the most reliable man in town in any practical emergency, appearing with tools or strength or steadiness at exactly the moment they were needed and departing without fanfare the moment he was no longer useful. But no one seemed to quite know him. Not really. He ate alone at the hotel dining room 3 evenings a week. He lived in a small house on the edge of town near the stable. He had no particular enemies and, from what Elvira could determine, no particular close friends. "Does he have family?" she asked Ajora one November evening as they sat by Ajora's fire with their respective books. Ajora looked up. She was not a woman who pretended not to know what you were asking. "He had a brother," she said. "Died of a fever 4 years ago. Their parents are gone too, from what I understand. He came here from Colorado originally, I think. Why? I am trying to understand him," Elvira said. He is a man who talks very little because he grew up in a house where talking very little was a way of surviving, Adjora said, with the directness that Elvira had come to love about her. Or at least that is my understanding. Men like that, when they do speak, they mean everything they say. Elvira considered that. He told me once that the sunset was going to be red, she said. What happened? The sunset was very red. I rest my case, Adjora said, and went back to her book. The crisis that changed everything arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Fitch, who rode into Coldwater Flats on a wet December morning with a horse that was badly lame and an attitude that made the horse's mood look cheerful by comparison. Gerald Fitch was a land speculator, one of those men who had followed the railroads west, buying up territory cheap and selling it expensive to people who did not fully understand what they were buying. He was in his mid-40s, broad in the face and narrow in the principle, and he had with him two men who functioned as a kind of permanent entourage of menace. He went first to the saloon, which was its own statement. Then he went to the land office. Then, with a determination that Elvira would not understand until later, he went to the schoolhouse. She was in the middle of a history lesson. She had been explaining the significance of the Compromise of 1850, and the children had been listening with varying degrees of engagement. And Robert Caldwell had just asked a question that was genuinely quite sharp for a 12-year-old. When the door opened without a knock and Gerald Fitch walked in as though he owned the room. "Miss Underwood," he said. The children had gone very still, the way children do when adult energy enters a room at the wrong frequency. "We are in the middle of a lesson, Mr." She paused. "Fitch. Gerald Fitch." He said it like it was supposed to mean something. "I will not be long. I need to speak with you about the land this schoolhouse sits on." Elvira looked at him steadily. "After school hours, Mr. Fitch, 3 o'clock. Something crossed his face, surprise maybe, that she had not immediately bent to accommodate him. He looked at the children, he looked at her, he left. She finished the lesson with absolute composure, and none of her students, she thought, could have guessed that her hands under the desk were pressed flat against her skirt to keep them from shaking. Not from fear, exactly. From anger, which was a different thing and in some ways a more useful one. Gerald Fitch returned at 3 o'clock with one of his men and a document from the land office. The document, he explained in the comfortable voice of a man who had delivered this kind of news many times, indicated that the schoolhouse was built on land that he had purchased 3 weeks prior from a man named Henry Dawes, who had apparently owned it without anyone in Coldwater Flats being entirely certain of this. He intended to break the structure down and build a warehouse. "The school committee will contest this," Elvira said. "The school committee is welcome to contest whatever they like," Gerald Fitch said. "Lawyers cost money. My lawyers cost more than the school committee has." He left. She stood in the empty schoolhouse for a long moment, listening to the wind come under the door, looking at the blackboard where she had written the date in her careful script, and she thought about 14 children who had started to trust that this room would always be here for them. And something inside her went very firm and very cold and very clear. She went to find Margaret Hobbs, who convened an emergency school committee meeting that evening in the back room of the general store. There were 7 people on the committee, and they were all deeply alarmed, and they had between them very little in the way of immediate solutions. The land title seemed legitimate. Their own claim to the property was, it emerged, somewhat murkier than anyone had realized. They had been using the land on a handshake arrangement with Henry Dawes for 6 years, but a handshake arrangement was not, as it turned out, a deed. Elvira sat through the meeting listening carefully. She asked several precise questions. She made notes. After the meeting, walking home through the cold night air, she passed the livery stable. The lights were on inside, which surprised her. It was past 9 o'clock. She could hear the sound of work. She stopped. She did not know exactly why she stopped. She had not intended to speak to Calvin Sutton about any of this. It was not his problem. He was not her confidant. They had exchanged perhaps 200 words total in the 5 months she had been in Coldwater Flats, and 200 was probably generous. But she stopped, and after a moment she knocked on the door frame because the door was open. He appeared from around the back of a stall, holding a lamp. He looked at her and his expression was, as always, that particular kind of contained attention that she had come to recognize as his primary mode of existence. "I apologize for the hour," she said. He shook his head slightly. "It's all right," that movement said, and it said it clearly. "I had a difficult meeting this evening," she said. "I'm not sure why I am telling you this. I suppose I did not want to be in my room just yet." He set the lamp on a post hook and leaned against the stall door and waited, not impatiently, not with any sign that he found the intrusion unwelcome, just waited with that quality of attention that made her feel peculiarly like whatever she said next would be heard completely. So she told him about Gerald Fitch and the land and the schoolhouse. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence, and then he said, "Henry Dawes sold it, apparently." "Henry Dawes left town 8 months ago," Calvin said. "Went to Santa Fe, said he was selling everything." "Did he tell anyone he owned that land?" A pause. "He told me he owned everything on 2nd and 3rd Street when he was talking about what he was going to sell. Said he had the papers." "Did he say anything about the schoolhouse specifically?" Another pause, longer this time, the kind that meant he was thinking carefully rather than that he did not know. "He said the schoolhouse had been on land he owned for years, and he had never had papers drawn up to gift it to the town. Said it had just been understood." "Understood," Elvira repeated, and the word had a hollow quality when she said it. "I am sorry," Calvin said, and it was only 2 words, but they carried in them a weight of genuine meaning. "It is not your fault," she said, "but thank you for listening." She walked home through the night, and she was still upset, but there was something different in the texture of it now, less alone in it somehow, though she could not have explained precisely why. The next morning she wrote 3 letters. One to the territorial government in Santa Fe, requesting information about the process of contesting a land sale on the grounds of community use. One to a lawyer she had once met in Abilene, asking whether he knew anyone in New Mexico territory who took on cases with a public interest element. And one to Henry Dawes himself, through the Santa Fe Post, asking him to confirm or deny the circumstances of the sale. Gerald Fitch, meanwhile, was making himself known around town in ways that were carefully calibrated to create the impression that his arrival was a good thing for Coldwater Flats. He talked about the warehouse bringing commerce. He talked about jobs. He bought rounds at the saloon and smiled at the women on the street, and sat in the front pew at church on Sunday with his hat in his hands, and his expression arranged in a shape that resembled respectability. Elvira watched this performance from across the street and felt a clarity of purpose that she had rarely felt about anything in her life. She also noticed that Calvin Sutton, who was working outside the livery stable that Sunday morning, while the rest of the town was in church, watched Gerald Fitch's arrival with an expression that was not anger, but was a kind of stillness that felt, to Elvira's increasingly calibrated eye, like the stillness of someone who was deciding something. The letter from Henry Dawes arrived 17 days later. It was 3 lines long. "Miss Underwood, I sold the land in good conscience, believing it was mine to sell. I did not realize the school committee had a legitimate claim. If there is anything I can provide in the way of written testimony, I am prepared to do so. Sincerely, Henry Dawes." It was not a deed. It was not a legal document. But it was something, and Elvira had learned in Abilene that something was always the beginning of enough. She brought the letter to the committee meeting that week and watched the mood in the room shift. Margaret Hobbs declared it a breakthrough with an emotion that was somewhere between relief and triumph. The lawyer Elvira had contacted in Abilene had replied that he knew a man in Las Cruces who did exactly this kind of work and would write to him immediately. Calvin Sutton appeared at the school committee meeting that evening, which was unusual since he was not on the committee. He sat in the back of the room without being asked permission and listened to the whole thing, and when it was over and people were filing out, he stopped Elvira at the door. "I can speak to the county assessor," he said. He knows me. Might help to have someone ask in person about the history of that deed." Elvira looked at him. "That would require you to do a great deal of talking," she said, and there was warmth in it, not criticism. Something moved across his face that was, she was increasingly certain, the closest thing to a smile that Calvin Sutton typically produced, a slight shift around the eyes and mouth that communicated amusement without committing to it. "I will manage," he said. The following week he rode to the county assessor's office in Mesilla and came back with a document establishing that the land had been listed in county records for 7 years under the name of the Coldwater Flats Common Use Trust, a designation that Henry Dawes had apparently neither created nor been aware of, but which existed in the records nonetheless, and which made the straightforward sale of the land to Gerald Fitch legally questionable. It was not a victory, but it was a wall that Gerald Fitch's lawyers would have to climb over, and it bought the school committee the time they needed for the Las Cruces lawyer, a sharp-minded man named Thomas Aguilar, to arrive and begin building a proper case. On the evening Calvin Sutton returned from Mesilla, Elvira was waiting on the bench outside the livery stable. She had told herself she was not waiting. She had told herself she was simply sitting in the cool evening air with a book, but she had read the same page 4 times, so that argument had limited credibility. He rode up just before dark, and when he saw her he dismounted in one practiced movement and led his horse through the gate with that same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, and then he came and stood in front of her. "The assessor helped," she said. "He did, Calvin." She said his name and watched something very small and very significant happen in his expression. "Thank you, you did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "Why did you?" she asked. She was looking directly at him. It was getting dark, and the lamp over the stable door was making the light soft and uncertain, and she was aware, in a way she had been becoming increasingly aware for weeks, of exactly how close they were standing. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who did not know what to say, but the deliberate quiet of someone choosing words with unusual care. "The children need that school," he said finally. "And you are—" He stopped. He looked away for a brief moment and then back at her. "You are good at what you do." It was not a declaration. It was not a love poem. It was 5 words delivered in the most carefully underplayed voice she had ever heard, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a weight and a warmth that she felt for days afterward. "As are you," she said, "with the horses and everything else." He nodded once. The conversation, as was his way, was finished. But before he went inside, he looked back at her, and the look lasted a beat longer than it needed to, and she thought about that particular extra beat for a considerable time after she had gone home. Christmas came to Coldwater Flats with the scrubby desert version of festivity, a spruce branch or two, some candles, the church choir doing their earnest best with limited musical resources, and Elvira spent the day at Jora's table with a group of women and their families who had collectively decided to make something warm and convivial out of the holiday. And it was a good day, genuinely good, the kind of day that makes you feel the full texture of belonging somewhere. Calvin Sutton was not there, because Calvin Sutton was not the kind of man who attended large social gatherings. But he had left, sometime in the pre-dawn quiet of Christmas morning, a bundle of firewood at the schoolhouse door, enough to last 3 weeks, and beside it a small wrapped paper parcel that contained, when Elvira opened it later that day at Jora's table with what she hoped was a calm expression, a book. It was a volume of natural history with careful color illustrations of the plants and birds of the Southwest, and inside the front cover he had written in handwriting that was surprisingly careful and precise for a man of his profession. "The sunset bird on page 47 is the one you asked about in October." She had asked in October during one of their increasingly regular conversations at the livery stable door. What the small bird with the reddish tail was that she kept seeing at dusk. She had assumed he had forgotten. "Oh," said Jora, looking at the inscription over Elvira's shoulder, and her voice had a quality in it that contained entire sentences she was choosing not to speak aloud. "Don't," said Elvira. "I did not say a word," said Adjora. Elvira kept the book on her bedside table and turned to page 47 every few days for months. The land case moved forward through January with the grinding pace of legal processes conducted by mail across large distances. Thomas Aguilar in Las Cruces was thorough and methodical and wrote letters that made Gerald Fitch's lawyers nervous, which was exactly what they were supposed to do. Gerald Fitch himself had modulated his manner in town from expansive confidence to something more guarded, though he had not left, which Elvira noted as a sign that he still believed he had a path to winning. The school continued. The children continued. Benjamin Caldwell had progressed so rapidly in arithmetic that Elvira was beginning to wonder whether he had a genuine gift for mathematics, and she wrote a letter to the territory's school administration asking whether there were any scholarship provisions for talented students from frontier communities. The answer was discouraging but not entirely closed, and she filed it in the category of things to pursue further when the immediate crisis was resolved. In February, a rancher named Santos Reyes rode into town with a horse that had developed a problem that his own ranch hands could not address, and he sat outside the livery stable for 2 hours waiting for Calvin Sutton to be free. And during those 2 hours, he and Elvira had the kind of wide-ranging conversation that happens when two intelligent people are both waiting for something and have nothing else to do. Santos Reyes was in his 40s, a second-generation rancher whose family had been in the territory since before it was a territory, and he had a way of seeing Coldwater Flats and its people that was illuminating. "Calvin Sutton," Santos said at one point when Elvira mentioned the land case and Calvin's help with it. "Good man. Lost his brother before he came here, you know. They were partners working a horse operation up in Colorado. Brother died and Calvin came south. He does not talk about it, but you can read it in him." "He does not talk about much," Elvira said. "No," Santos agreed, "but he talks to you." Elvira glanced at him. "We exchange a few sentences here and there." Santos Reyes gave her a look that had in it an extremely specific kind of knowledge. "Miss Underwood," he said gently, "I have known that man for 3 years. I have spent 20-minute sessions trying to get him to tell me whether he prefers his coffee with sugar, and I have consistently failed. The fact that he talks to you is not nothing. In fact, it is a very great something." She sat with that for a long time after Santos Reyes and his horse had gone. She sought Calvin out that evening in the deliberate way she was allowing herself to do more frequently now, with less pretense that it was incidental. She knocked on the livery door and he appeared, and they stood in the doorway the way they often did now, in the particular comfortable arrangement that had established itself over months of exactly this kind of standing. "Mr. Reyes told me about your brother," she said. "I am sorry, I should not have mentioned it if it is not something you want to discuss." He was quiet for a moment, but it was not a closing off quiet. It was a processing quiet, and she had learned the difference. "Daniel," he said finally. "His name was Daniel. He was 2 years younger than me." A pause. "He laughed constantly about everything. I never understood how he did it." "Did it help?" she asked. "To leave Colorado?" "Helped me get up in the mornings," he said. "For a while that was enough." "And now?" she asked very quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight his gray-green eyes had a quality she could not quite translate. "And now," he said, with an emphasis that was minimal and enormous at the same time, "there are other things." She did not push past that. She did not need to. She understood that for Calvin Sutton, "other things" was a sentence that someone else would have taken 3 paragraphs to deliver, and she had learned to receive it at its actual weight. She walked home with her heart making that nameless thing happen in her chest again. And when she got into bed, she opened the natural history book to page 47 and looked at the sunset bird with the reddish tail, and felt something she was beginning to stop arguing with. March came in with wind and a brief, violent thunderstorm that blew the schoolhouse door off one of its hinges. Elvira arrived the following morning to find it already fixed. She had not even had to send word. She knew who had fixed it without asking, because this was a language she had become fluent in. The land case came to its resolution in late March of 1879, in the form of a ruling from the Dona Ana County Circuit Court that the common use trust designation invalidated the sale to Gerald Fitch, on the grounds that the land had been in community use for a period sufficient to establish a legal claim that superseded the private sale. Thomas Aguilar wrote the news in a letter that arrived on a Thursday, and Elvira read it 3 times standing in the middle of her classroom with her students watching her with curious expressions. "Is it good news or bad news?" asked Benjamin Caldwell. "It is very good news," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Is it about the school?" asked his brother Robert. "It is very much about the school," she said. The town celebrated in its practical way. Margaret Hobbs organized a supper, the general store donated supplies, and most of Coldwater Flats turned out to the social hall for an evening of food and conversation, and eventually, fiddle music courtesy of a man named Pedro Vargas, whose fiddle playing was somewhat better than his modesty suggested. Elvira looked for Calvin Sutton at the celebration and found him, as she would have predicted, at the edge of things, standing near the back wall with a cup of coffee, watching the room with that expression of contained, comfortable observation. She made her way to him through the crowd and stood beside him. "We won," she said. "I know," he said. "Margaret told me." A pause. "Are you happy?" The question was direct in a way that was entirely characteristic of him. He did not waste language on preamble when the question itself was the point. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, and the word had in it a warmth that was clearly not only about the land case, and she felt it land in that specific place in her chest where all his words had been accumulating since October. Gerald Fitch left Coldwater Flats the following week, without ceremony or farewell. His 2 men went with him. The town did not discuss it much, because the town was in the particular way of places that have been inconvenienced by someone passing through, glad they were gone, unwilling to give them more time and attention than they had already consumed. April arrived with wildflowers, small, fierce, entirely improbable in the landscape they had chosen, which Elvira found philosophically appropriate. She was spending more of her evenings at the livery stable, and she had stopped pretending, even to herself, that these visits were incidental. She and Calvin had reached the stage of their acquaintance where words were not always necessary, which in his case was a kind of intimacy that she had not encountered before but recognized as something particular and real. He had started teaching her about horses, in the way he taught everything through demonstration rather than explanation, through patient, precise showing rather than telling. She had learned that the way a horse holds its ears tells you things, and that the pressure of a hand in the right place means calm, and that the relationship between a farrier and an animal is a negotiation built on trust accumulated very slowly. "Is that how you are with people too?" she asked one evening in April when she had been sitting on a hay bale watching him work with a young horse that was nervous and uncertain. "What do you mean?" he said, not looking up from the horse's leg. "Slow trust," she said, "building it carefully." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is the only kind that holds." She thought about all the ways she had seen that to be true in her own life, and all the ways she had seen it to be true about him, and she said, "I think you might be right." He looked at her then, and the look was different from the look she had catalogued and studied over the past months. It was more open, less contained. It was the look of a man who had decided something and was allowing the decision to show. "Elvira," he said. She had heard her name from him perhaps twice before, and both times it had been in a context that gave it no particular weight. This time it was different. This time it was the kind of name saying that is actually a complete sentence. "Yes," she said, "because sometimes you can answer a question before it is fully asked." "I would like to spend more time with you," he said. "Intentionally." She looked at him, at the angular, careful, weather-worked face that she had been looking at in her mind's eye for 6 months. At the eyes that had heard her, she realized, more completely and more carefully than almost anyone she had ever spoken to. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded once, which was his version of a complete and happy response, and went back to the horse. But there was something in the line of his shoulders that was lighter than usual, and she felt something in herself that was lighter too. They began, in the deliberate and unhurried way that suited them both, to court. It was not a dramatic courtship by any external measure. There were no grand gestures or operatic declarations. There were walks on Sunday afternoon when the light was long and golden, and there were evenings at a Giora's table where the four of them, a Giora, and an increasingly frequent visitor named Raymond Morse, who was the town's telegraph operator and very much in love with a Giora, though he was taking a geological amount of time to say so, sat and talked about everything and nothing. There were shared dinners at the hotel, which was a significant thing for Calvin, who had eaten there alone for years, and who sat across from Elvira now with an expression that she could only describe as quietly joyful, which was, she was learning, the only kind of joy he had. She was learning him the way you learn a language that has different rules than any language you have previously spoken, not with difficulty, but with the understanding that some things that would be sentences in another language are single words here, and some things that would be single words are entire paragraphs. When he was unhappy about something, he was quieter than usual, and the quality of the quiet was different. When he was pleased about something, he spoke slightly more readily, with the barest increase in warmth. When he was moved by something, by a sunset, by a particularly good piece of work, by something she said that landed, there was a moment of very complete stillness followed by a breath, and then a look in her direction that said everything he had not spoken. She was the only person, she gradually understood, to whom he had ever talked this much. The understanding did not arrive all at once, but in pieces, things that Santos Reyes said, things that Margaret Hobbs mentioned with a kind of wondering quality, the way people in Coldwater Flats sometimes looked at the two of them together with an expression of slightly baffled warmth. Calvin Sutton, who spoke perhaps 50 words in a month to the rest of the world, spoke to Elvira Underwood in full sentences, in paragraphs, in long, quiet conversations that lasted until the lamp burned low, and one of them eventually said that they supposed they ought to go in. She had asked him once in May how that was that he talked to her when he talked to almost no one else. He had thought about it for a long time, the way he thought about things that mattered. "You listen differently," he said finally. "How do you mean?" "Most people listen to decide what to say next," he said. "You listen to understand what is being said." She had felt the truth of that so precisely that it had taken her a moment to respond. "I have always thought that the worst thing you could do to a person is not hear them," she said. "Yes," he said. "Exactly yes." She had reached across the small space between them on the bench where they were sitting and taken his hand, which was large and calloused and warm, and he had looked down at their joined hands and then up at her, and his expression had such a complete and overwhelming quality of finally in it that she had felt her eyes sting with something she did not try to name. June arrived. The school year was approaching its end, and Elvira was already planning the autumn curriculum with the particular anticipation of a teacher who had genuinely loved her first year. The Caldwell twins, Benjamin and Robert, were going to move on to a different level of study. She had spoken to their parents about the boys' abilities and the possibility of a proper secondary education, and those conversations were moving in promising directions. Several of the younger children had made progress that she documented carefully and felt good about in the deep, steady way of work done properly. She also wrote to the territorial school administration again about Benjamin's mathematical gifts, and this time the response was different. There was a program, they said, at the new school in Albuquerque, and there might be a place for a boy of his demonstrated ability. It was not a certainty, but it was a door. She told Calvin about it on a Sunday walk in June, when the desert was doing its extraordinary summer thing. The heat was substantial, but the evening air still had a softness in it, and the sky was the particular color it turned at 7 o'clock that she now understood was the color of the bird on page 47 of her natural history book. Benjamin Caldwell in Albuquerque, Calvin said, in the tone of someone genuinely thinking about it. He might be remarkable, Elvira said, at mathematics, really remarkable, and remarkable things should not be confined to what is immediately available. Calvin was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Daniel was remarkable at reading horses. He could look at an animal for 30 seconds and know things it took other men a month to learn. A pause. I always wanted to take him somewhere he could use that fully. We ran out of time. She stopped walking and turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon with that expression that was not sadness exactly, but something adjacent to it, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of loss without self-pity, which she had come to recognize as his particular form of grief. You are not going to run out of time with Benjamin Caldwell, she said. He is 12 years old and he has years ahead of him. Calvin looked at her. No, he said, we are not going to run out of time. The we arrived in the conversation so simply and so completely that she almost did not catch it, and then she did, and she felt it settle between them like something that had been true for a while and was only now being said. Calvin, she said. I know, he said. He was looking at her with that look that was now fully open, no containment in it, no careful management, just the thing itself. I know what I want. I am not a man who is good at speeches. I do not need a speech, she said. I know, he said again, and a very small, very real smile moved across his face. That is one of the things. One of the things, she repeated. One of many, he said. And the simplicity of it and the weight of it were so exactly matched that she felt tears starting and blinked them back, not from embarrassment, but because she wanted to see him clearly. I love you, she said, because she was the one who was good at words, and she had decided that in this particular case she would say the full sentence. The stillness that came over him when she said it was the most complete stillness she had ever seen him hold, and then he let out a long breath and said, Yes, and then, I love you, Elvira, and the way he said her name made it sound like a word he had been holding carefully and was finally setting down in the right place. He took both her hands and they stood in the desert evening with the sky going red and gold behind the mesa and the sage smell sharp and clean in the air. And she thought that if this was what staying in one place felt like, she had chosen exactly the right one. The summer of 1879 moved through Coldwater Flats with the particular quality of a summer when everything is quietly becoming what it is going to be. Calvin and Elvira were a recognized fact now. The town had absorbed them as a pair with a warmth that was tinged with the specific satisfaction of people who feel they have witnessed something that was always going to be true and are pleased to see it confirmed. Margaret Hobbs told Elvira at least 3 times that she had known from the very first day, which Elvira received with polite skepticism, since she herself had not known from the first day, and she had been considerably better positioned to notice. Ajora, meanwhile, had solved the problem of Raymond Morse's geological approach to declarations by the extremely direct method of telling him at dinner one evening that she liked him considerably, and that if he had any similar feelings, he was welcome to say so at his earliest convenience. Raymond Morse had turned the color of a geranium and then said that yes, he did, very much, and the two of them had proceeded from there with a speed that was somewhat more decisive than Raymond had managed on his own. Elvira found this enormously satisfying in a way that she told Calvin about later, and he had listened with that slight movement around his eyes that was his version of laughing. In August, Calvin asked Elvira to marry him. He did it the way he did everything important, simply, directly, without preamble or performance. They were sitting on the bench outside the livery stable in the evening, which had become their habitual territory, and he turned to look at her and said, I want to marry you. I know you have a life here that is yours and I do not want to complicate it, but I want to build something with you." She looked at him. "What would we build?" she asked, not because she was uncertain of her answer, but because she wanted to hear his vision. He had thought about it. She could tell from the readiness of his response that he had thought about it carefully and at length. "A proper house," he said, "not a room above a shop. Something with a garden if you want, space for books. I have some money saved, 4 years of savings, I have not spent much. And the stable is mine, I own the land outright. If I built a house on the south edge of the property, we would have enough." A pause. "You would keep teaching. I would not want you to stop. It is what you are. We would just also be—" He paused again and searched for the word with a care she knew was real. "Together, in the full way." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That quickly." "Calvin," she said, "I have been saying yes to you in my head since approximately October. It just took a while to get the question into the right shape." The thing that happened to his face then was the most openly joyful thing she had ever seen there, and she put her hand against his jaw because she wanted to feel it, and he turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and she understood that this was a man who put everything he could not say into the things he did. They were married in October of 1879, in the small stone church at the end of the main street, with the territorial minister who came through Coldwater Flats every 3 months, and the entire town in attendance, and a Giora as Elvira's witness and Santos Reyes as Calvin's, and the Caldwell twins scrubbed into uncomfortable respectability in the front pew, and Margaret Hobbs crying from the second row with complete lack of self-consciousness, and the desert light coming through the windows at that particular autumn angle that made everything look like it was inside a painting. Calvin had written vows. He had written them himself, in that careful, precise handwriting, and he read them from a small folded piece of paper, and they were 8 sentences long, and every single sentence was exactly what he meant, without excess and without omission. And Elvira stood across from him with her heart making more noise than she thought was strictly appropriate in a church, and thought that she had never, in her entire life, felt more completely heard. She had written vows that were rather longer because she was who she was, and she read them in a voice that was steadier than she felt, and watched his face while she read and saw every word land. The house took 3 months to build, with substantial community assistance. Santos Reyes brought 2 ranch hands for the heavy work. Raymond Morse turned out to be unexpectedly skilled with a saw, and Margaret Hobbs organized food for the working parties with the efficiency of a military operation. The resulting house was solid and low-ceilinged, and had a porch that faced the sunset and a room that Elvira turned immediately into a library, and a kitchen that was considerably more spacious than anything she had previously cooked in, though her cooking skills were, she cheerfully admitted, a work in progress. Calvin's cooking was better than hers, which was a fact that surprised exactly no one who knew him, since his approach to everything was slow, careful, and attentive to detail. He taught her things. She taught him things. This was, she came to understand, the central mechanism of their life together, a continuous exchange in which each of them was always both teacher and student. The winter of 1879 and into 1880 settled around the house, and the stable, and the school like something that had always been there. Elvira woke in the mornings to the smell of coffee and the sound of Calvin moving in the kitchen, and she lay in the warmth of the bed for a few minutes each morning, savoring the particular luxury of not being alone in a way she had not fully realized she had been. He left for the stable with the first light, and she left for the school an hour later, and in the evenings they met on the porch or in the kitchen or in the library and talked, or did not talk in the equal comfort of both. He was learning, she observed, to speak a little more readily in larger company. Not much. Not into the 50 words a month territory that the saloon bet referenced, but enough that people who had known him for years occasionally looked slightly startled when he offered an opinion or an observation in a group setting. Santos Reyes said to Elvira once, with a warmth that was genuine and unironic, that Calvin Sutton in the past year had said more words to more people than in the previous 3 years combined. And Santos attributed this directly to Elvira, who disputed the attribution and was fairly certain she was wrong to do so. Spring arrived with the wildflowers again, and with news from Albuquerque that Benjamin Caldwell had been accepted to the school there on the strength of his demonstrated mathematical ability. A letter had come, addressed to Elvira as the person who had advocated for him, and she had brought it to the Caldwell home and watched the boy's face go through several rapid transformations from disbelief to comprehension to something that was the beginning of real excitement. His parents, who were practical people of limited means, were worried about cost. Elvira and Calvin had already discussed this. Calvin made a contribution. He named it a loan to be repaid whenever Benjamin chose to repay it, which was, Elvira knew, his way of giving something without requiring it to feel like charity, and several other members of the community added to it. And the problem was, not easily but genuinely, solved. Benjamin Caldwell left for Albuquerque in the summer of 1880, with a new trunk and a head full of numbers and an expression of terrified excitement. And Robert Caldwell stood on the platform watching his twin's departure with a complex face that Elvira sat beside and simply witnessed. And she thought about what Calvin had said about Daniel and about not running out of time, and she was glad. In the autumn of 1880, Elvira discovered she was pregnant. She told Calvin in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and his response was a stillness that lasted perhaps 5 full seconds, followed by him setting down the coffee cup he was holding with very deliberate care, following by him coming around the table to where she was sitting and kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in both of his. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He pressed her hands together between his and looked at her with an expression that was so open and so full that she felt as though she were seeing the full interior of him in a way that was very rare and very privileged. And he said, "Good. That is good." It was entirely inadequate as a response to the news that they were going to have a child. It was also, she thought, exactly right. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, uncomfortable in the ordinary ways, and complicated by the New Mexico summer heat, and improved considerably by the presence of a Giora, who had a comprehensive and practical knowledge of what to do and what not to do, and was unintimidated by any of it. Elvira continued teaching through the spring term and arranged for a substitute, a young woman named Clara Pina, who had completed secondary schooling in Santa Fe and was sharp and enthusiastic, to take the class for the period around the birth. The baby arrived in May of 1881. He was a boy, and he arrived with a set of lungs that made his presence in the world immediately and emphatically clear. And Calvin held him for the first time with the hands that could work a horse's hoof with more delicacy than most men brought to anything, and looked down at the small red face with an expression that Elvira watched from the bed and stored in the deepest part of her memory. They named him Daniel Reyes Sutton, Daniel for the brother, Reyes because Santos had been, in every practical way, the closest thing to a friend Calvin had known before Elvira, and because Santos had stood beside him at their wedding and ridden through a December storm to help with the house roof, and never once in 3 years asked Calvin for more conversation than he was able to give. Santos Reyes, when he was told the middle name, looked for a long moment at the middle distance, and then at Calvin with an expression that was entirely too much for words, and Calvin met his eye and gave him the slight nod that meant everything, and they left it at that. Daniel Reyes Sutton turned out to be a child of enthusiastic noise and absolute determination, who had, from the earliest age, strong opinions about everything and no particular hesitation about expressing them. He was, in other words, the furthest possible thing from his father in surface manner, and the closest possible thing to his father in fundamental character. The determination was the same, the patience, once you saw it, was the same, the quality of attention was the same. Elvira returned to teaching when Daniel was 4 months old, with the assistance of a local woman named Petra Sosa, who came each morning to the house and was wonderfully capable and fond of the baby. Calvin reorganized his working hours so that he was always finished at the stable by early afternoon, which meant that he was the one who put Daniel down for his afternoon rest, which meant that Calvin Sutton, the quietest man in the territory, spent a portion of each day talking to an infant in a low, even murmur that was the exact same tone he used with nervous horses, and the baby found it absolutely effective. The years moved the way years do in a life that has found its shape. 1881 into 1882 into 1883. Elvira continued to teach, continued to advocate, continued to write the letters and ask the questions and push the doors that needed pushing. She got a second stove for the schoolhouse, which the children required in winter. She got new reading books, half of them donated by a women's reading circle in Santa Fe that she had contacted after a 3-year letter-writing acquaintance with its president. She got a globe, which the older children treated with the reverence of something that had come from another dimension, which in a way it had. Calvin's reputation as a farrier had by 1883 extended so far through the territory that he had more work than he could comfortably handle alone, and he took on an apprentice, a young man of 20 named Tomás Aguirre, who had grown up on one of Santos Reyes's neighboring ranches and had the same quality of quiet attention with animals that Calvin had. Teaching Tomás turned Calvin into a person who talked during the workday, which Tomás later told his own family was the most educational silence interrupted by precise instruction he had ever experienced. In 1883, Benjamin Caldwell came home from Albuquerque for Christmas. He was now 16, and the boy who had entered Elvira's classroom with his twins' matching expression of speculative mischief had become something considerably more taller than both his parents, with a precision of thought and a confidence of manner that was not arrogance but the particular bearing of someone who has been told they are capable of something and has discovered it to be true. He sat at Elvira and Calvin's table for dinner on Christmas Day and talked about the mathematics he was studying, and Daniel Sutton, who was 2.5 and did not follow any of it, watched Benjamin with the focused attention of someone who recognized a person of interest when they saw one. After dinner, when Daniel was asleep and Tomás had gone home, and it was just the 4 adults, Elvira and Calvin, Benjamin and Robert Caldwell, who had stayed in Coldwater Flats and was now doing the beautiful detailed cartographic work that his childhood map drawing had pointed toward, Benjamin said something that Elvira turned over in her mind for a long time after. He said, "Miss Underwood, I mean Mrs. Sutton, do you know what I think about sometimes? I think about how when I was in your class, I felt like someone was actually seeing what I was good at for the first time. Not just seeing that I was troublesome, but seeing what was actually there." He paused. "And I think about how that changed everything, so thank you." She looked at him across the table and felt the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of work that was done in the right spirit and found its mark. "You did the work," she said. "I only pointed at the door." "Someone has to point at the door," Benjamin said. Calvin, from across the table, caught her eye. His expression said simply yes. In the spring of 1884, Elvira discovered she was pregnant again. The second pregnancy was harder. She was 29 now, and the heat of the New Mexico summer was even less accommodating the second time, and she was also teaching and mothering a 3-year-old simultaneously, which was its own undertaking. Calvin was quietly, completely, and entirely present throughout. He fixed things before they needed fixing. He took Daniel to the stable every afternoon with the unargued assumption that this was what they were doing. He made coffee at 5 in the morning because she had found that strong coffee was the only thing that addressed the nausea, and he had simply started making it earlier. He also talked to her more than he had ever talked to anyone. She had understood this for years, but during that second pregnancy she felt it with a particular clarity. The way he had arranged his entire interior life around being available to her, not in the suffocating way of someone who had decided she needed managing, but in the way of a man who had chosen to direct all his attention towards something he valued completely. "You are very good at this," she told him one evening when he was sitting beside her with his hand resting on her side in the particular place that seemed to help most. "At what?" he asked. "At being in love," she said, "with all the practical specifics of it, the being present, the noticing." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I had a lot of years of practice at being very careful with things that mattered." She understood that he meant the horses. She also understood that he meant more than the horses. "I know," she said and took his hand. "I noticed. The second child was a girl." She arrived in October of 1884, calmer and more deliberate about it than her brother had been. She entered the world quietly, looked around with dark gray eyes that Calvin immediately recognized as his own in someone else's face, and settled in as though she had already decided to like it here. They named her Clara Elvira Sutton. Clara for the young substitute teacher who had become a permanent addition to the Coldwater Flats school, and was now co-teaching with Elvira with a partnership so effective that the school had doubled its enrollment from neighboring homesteads. Elvira because some people deserve to have their name given to the best things. Elvira herself, when she was told, said simply, "Well," and then held the baby for 20 minutes without speaking, which was extremely unlike her, and which was therefore the most eloquent thing she had ever communicated. Clara Elvira Sutton grew up quiet like her father, which surprised no one, and fiercely precise about everything, which also surprised no one. Daniel, 3 years older, took his role as older brother with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally overzealous. He had a habit, Elvira noted, of explaining things to Clara in careful detail whether or not Clara had asked, which Clara received with the patient expression of someone who was mostly listening in order to identify the errors. By 1886, Coldwater Flats had grown. The railroad had come through the territory, and while it had not come directly through Coldwater Flats, it had come within 12 miles, which was close enough to change things. New families arrived. The school grew from 1 room to 2, with the addition of a proper second classroom that the town funded with a civic pride that Elvira accepted with transparent gratitude. Clara Pina, now Clara Vargas, having married Pedro the fiddle player in a ceremony of considerable musical enthusiasm, ran the second classroom, and Elvira ran the first, and between them they managed the children of Coldwater Flats with a complementary skill that people in neighboring communities occasionally came to observe. The injustices of the territory did not, of course, stop existing because Elvira had found happiness. She was not a person who could be happy in a sealed world. She was aware of, and troubled by, the ways in which the territory's growth was managed at the expense of people who had been there long before any of them. The Mescalero Apache communities that continued to be pushed and constrained and diminished by federal policy, the Mexican families whose land grants were questioned and undermined by the same legal mechanisms that Gerald Fitch had tried to use against the schoolhouse, the Chinese laborers who had built the railroad, and were now subjected to exclusion laws that stripped them of rights and dignity. She read about these things. She wrote about them. She wrote letters to the territorial newspaper that were sometimes published under her name and sometimes not, depending on the editor's mood that week and how controversial the content was. Calvin read everything she wrote. He read it carefully, the way he did everything, and occasionally he made observations that were brief and precise and exactly to the point, and she had learned to weigh these observations heavily because they were never casual. He said once, about a piece she had written on the Apache land questions, "The law is made by people who are not hurt by it, which means the people who are hurt by it have to be very loud to be heard." She had looked at him. Says the quietest man in the territory. He had considered this. "I was never quiet when it mattered," he said. She thought about that, about the county assessor's office and the common use trust document and the fact that he had gone to Mesilla and talked when it was necessary. "No," she said, "you were not. Being quiet," he said, "is not the same as being absent." She wrote that down afterward because it was one of those things that deserved to be written down. The territory around them continued to change with the speed that the 1880s brought to the West. The cattle drives, the railroad, the towns that grew overnight and died the same way. The constant pressure and negotiation and contest of people trying to establish lives in a landscape that was generous and brutal in equal measure. Coldwater Flats held its ground and grew steadily, which was its character. It was not a boom town. It had never been a boom town. It was a town that had been built slowly by people who meant to stay. Calvin's business had expanded by 1887 into something that was less one farrier and more a small operation. Tamaz had become fully skilled and ran half the work independently, and a second apprentice had been added. A boy of 19 named Louis Garza, who had the same quality of quiet attentiveness that seemed to be the primary qualification for the work. Calvin trained with patience and precision, and the minimum of unnecessary words, and both young men talked about working for him with an admiration that was obvious and genuine. He had also, by this point, become the kind of man in Coldwater Flats that people went to when they needed a thing done and done correctly. Not loudly, he had not become loud, but he was present in the community in a way he had not been when Elvira arrived in 1878, and she thought sometimes about the 9 years between then and now, and about what had changed and what had stayed the same. The gray-green eyes were the same, still the most careful eyes she had ever been seen by. The quality of attention was the same. The way he listened, really listened, all the way to the end of what was being said was completely unchanged. What was different was that he was known, now, in a way he had not been before. Not famous, not celebrated, but known, in the specific sense of people knowing what he was made of and trusting it. That knowledge had been built slowly, in the way he said trust was always built, and it was the kind that held. In the autumn of 1887, Elvira was sitting on the porch in the early evening when Calvin came and sat beside her. Daniel, 6 years old, was inside doing something that involved a great deal of enthusiastic noise. Clara, 3, was asleep. The sun was going down behind the mesa in the colors that had no real names. "I have been thinking," Calvin said. "About what?" she said. "About the first year you were here," he said, "when you came off the stagecoach." She turned to look at him. This was more retrospective than he typically was. "What about it?" "I watched you come off the stagecoach," he said. He was looking at the sunset, not at her, but the tone of his voice was entirely present with her. "I thought that woman is going to change this place." She was quiet for a moment. "You thought that?" "I did." "You did not say anything," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I thought it." She looked at him, at the profile she had now spent 9 years learning, at the lines that the territory's sun had put into his face and the gray that had started to appear at his temples, at the hands that were resting on his knees with that characteristic stillness. "Was I right to come here?" she asked. "To this town? To this life?" He turned to look at her, and the look had in it everything she had accumulated of him. All the small words and precise observations and deliberate silences, and the morning coffee and the way he said her name, and the children's names and Daniel's middle name, and the way he had looked at their daughter for the first time, and the vows on the folded paper in the church with the desert light coming through the windows. "Yes," he said, "you were right." She reached over and took his hand, which was warm and present and entirely familiar in the way that years of taking someone's hand make something familiar, and they sat on the porch together and watched the sunset do its extraordinary thing. And inside the house, Daniel was still making noise, and somewhere in the back of the house, Clara would wake in an hour wanting her dinner. And there was school tomorrow, and work tomorrow, and letters to write and things to push against, and the territory expanding in all its difficult and beautiful ways around their small, sure point of it. and she thought that this was what she had come to Coldwater Flats for, though she had not known it when she stepped off the stagecoach into the New Mexico heat with her trunk and her lesson plans and her stubborn refusal to make herself small. She had come for this, for a place and a life, and a person whose silence was not emptiness but its opposite, who listened to everything and said only what was true, who had told her in 8 sentences at an altar in a small stone church exactly what she meant to him, and had been proving it daily for every year since. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, and then, because he was capable of it and had always been capable of it, "I love you, Elvira." The light on the mesa went from gold to rose to the deep color that had no name in any language, and the desert smelled of sage and coming night, and Calvin Sutton, the quietest man in the territory, sat beside the woman who had always heard everything he said, and they were entirely, exactly, irreversibly home. The years after that settled into the particular contentment of a life that knows what it is. Benjamin Caldwell returned from Albuquerque permanently in 1889, bringing with him a degree in applied mathematics and a position offer from the territorial surveyor's office in Mesilla, and Robert's cartographic work had been noticed by an engineering firm connected to the railroad, and both boys, men now, really, in their early 20s, had built something from the seeds of who they had always been. Elvira received a letter from Benjamin in that year that thanked her with a specificity and warmth that made her sit down at her kitchen table and take a moment to simply feel grateful for the work and the years. Daniel Sutton, 8 years old in 1889, had Calvin's eyes and Elvira's mouth, and a personality that somehow combined both their qualities in a way that was entirely its own. He was observant and deliberate but also verbal, thoughtful in the way of his father and articulate in the way of his mother. And his teacher, Clara Vargas, reported to Elvira with the particularly careful honesty of a colleague that he was the most interesting student she had taught, which Elvira received with appropriate maternal pride and professional distance. Clara Adjora Sutton, 5 in 1889, was learning to read with a focus that was almost alarming, making her way through books at a pace that reminded Elvira of herself at that age, and she had a quality that both her parents recognized and loved. She asked precise questions and then listened to the answers with complete attention, which was, Elvira thought, the most important skill a person could have. Ajora Kessler Morse, she had taken Raymond's name the previous year, in a ceremony that was small and direct and entirely characteristic of them both, had expanded her millinery business to include a small dress shop, and she and Raymond had a son named James who was Daniel's closest friend, and their lives were woven into the Suttons in the easy, durable way of people who have chosen each other over years. Santos Reyes came into town less frequently now, as the ranch required more of his time, but when he came, he always spent an evening at Calvin's table, and the two men sat and talked in their particular way, slow and patient and substantive, with none of the social performance that passed for conversation elsewhere. And Elvira always felt that these evenings were among the truest things she witnessed. In the spring of 1890, Elvira organized with the help of Clara Vargas and several women from the community a petition to the territorial government requesting formal recognition of the Coldwater Flats School as a district school with official funding and certification status. It was the culmination of 12 years of building and advocating and writing letters and pushing doors, and when the certification came through in the summer of 1890, there was a celebration at the social hall that was the largest the town had seen since the end of the land case, and Margaret Hobbs cried even more freely than she had at the wedding, which was saying something. Calvin stood beside Elvira at that celebration, and she could feel, in the way she had learned to feel everything about him, that he was deeply and completely pleased, not just for the school but for her, for the whole shape of what she had done and continued to do, and for the particular satisfaction of watching someone you love do the thing they were made to do. "Speech," said someone in the crowd, directed at Elvira, and everyone laughed, and she gave one clear and warm and properly expressed, in the way she had always been able to do with words, and at the end of it someone called Calvin Sutton, in the way that crowds sometimes do, testing the limits of the possible. He looked at the crowd with the gray-green eyes that she knew as well as she knew her own hands, and he said what she said, and everyone laughed, and it was exactly right, and Elvira caught his eye from across the room, and the look that passed between them was the complete text of a very long and happy book. That night, walking home under the enormous territorial sky with all its stars showing, Daniel and Clara, already carried home earlier by Petrososa, who still came to help on busy evenings, Calvin and Elvira walked the streets of Coldwater Flats in the late summer dark, and she thought about the stagecoach and the bench outside the livery stable, and the man who had barely glanced at her, and then gone back to his leather work, and she thought about all the words he had given her since carefully chosen. Precisely placed, every single one of them true. She had been told her whole life that being heard was something you had to earn by speaking louder. She had believed that, in the way you believe things you have never had cause to question. And then she had arrived in a town in the New Mexico territory and met a man who spoke at below the volume of the world and listened at above the volume of anyone she had ever known, and everything she had believed about being heard had been quietly, completely revised. He heard her. He had heard her from the beginning, she thought, from that first exchange about the mare and the hammer, from the evening at the livery stable when she told him about Gerald Fitch, from every conversation they had ever had where she had felt, in a way she never felt anywhere else, that she was being received entirely. And she had heard him. That was the other part of it, the part that was hers. She had heard the things he said and the things he did not say and the things he said by doing, and she had understood them and she had let them matter and she had built a life on them, and the life was true. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He had always known when she was in the middle of something. "I am thinking," she said, "about October of 1878, when I first saw you." "What about it?" "I thought you were the most contained person I had ever seen," she said, "like you were holding a very large amount of something very carefully." "What do you think now?" he asked. She looked at him in the dark, at the face she loved most in the world, at the eyes that were, as always, looking at her with that complete attention that was still, after all these years, the most powerful thing she had ever experienced. "I think I was right," she said, "and I think you found someone you could set it down with." He stopped walking. They were in the middle of the empty street, the stars overhead and the lamp lights of Coldwater Flats in the windows around them and the sage smell on the night air. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what happened." And he took her face in both his hands, the careful hands that worked with precision and patience and gentleness on everything that mattered, and he kissed her in the middle of the street in the darkness, which was more public affection than he had displayed in 12 years of marriage. And then he rested his forehead against hers and held it there, and she heard his breath and he heard hers, and they stayed that way for a long, full moment. "Shall we go home?" she said finally. "Yes," he said. And they went home to the house at the edge of the stable property, with its porch facing the sunset and its library full of books and its children asleep in their rooms, and the lamp they kept burning in the kitchen window, and the life they had built slowly and truly and well, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the whole extraordinary, specific thing,